The topic I'm going to talk about tonight is the topic of money and inflation. Inflation is a disease. It's a dangerous disease for a society. It is sometimes a fatal disease for a society. It's a disease that, if allowed to rage unchecked, can destroy a society. And we have many such examples. The classic examples, of course, are the extreme examples of Germany, of Austria, of Russia after the First World War, when inflation really did reach levels at which the kind of apocryphal story I told you was a literal description of the reality. When inflation reached levels at which employers would pay their workers 3 times a day after breakfast, lunch, and dinner so they could go out and spend the money before it lost all its value. That's the real extreme cases. But you don't have to go to such extreme cases to see the enormous harm which inflation left unchecked can do. You have the example in many examples in South America. Brazil, before 1964, was brought down by an inflation that led to a revolution that toppled the existing government in order to stem the inflation. In the famous case of Chile, with Mr. Allende in power, he produced an inflation, which was one of the major factors that caused the economic catastrophe that led to the replacement of his government by a military dictatorship. But it behooves us as a nation to pay attention to this disease, to ask ourselves, what is the cause of the disease? How do you cure the disease? What are the effects of the cure? What are the side effects of it? And what will happen if we don't cure it? And I propose to discuss the topic tonight under those headings, and then go on to consider in somewhat more specific detail the experience of the United States over the past decade or two and the present situation that we face. Now, the first step toward understanding the cause of inflation is to recognize that it is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. It's always and everywhere a result of too much money, of a more rapid increase in the quantity of money than an output. Moreover, in the modern era, the important next step is to recognize that today governments control the quantity of money, so that as a result, inflation in the United States is made in Washington and nowhere else. Of course, no government any more than any one of us likes to take responsibility for bad things. We're all of us human. If something bad happens, it wasn't our fault. And the government is the same way. So it doesn't accept responsibility for inflation. If you listen to people in Washington talk, they will tell you that inflation is produced by greedy businessmen, or it's produced by grasping unions, or it's produced by spendthrift consumers. Or maybe it's those terrible Arab sheiks who are producing it. Now, of course, businessmen are greedy. Who of us isn't? Trade unions are grasping. Who of us isn't? And there's no doubt that the consumer is a spendthrift. But none of them produce inflation, for the very simple reason that neither the businessman nor the trade union has a printing press in their basement on which they can turn out those green pieces of paper we call money. Only Washington has that printing press, and therefore only Washington can produce inflation. If you listen to the people from the communist world, they'll tell you inflation is a capitalist phenomenon. That's not true. If you look at Europe today, one of the most rapid rates of inflation in Europe has been in Yugoslavia, which is a communist country. One of the slowest rates of inflation has been in Switzerland, which is a capitalist country. So inflation is not a capitalist phenomenon. But neither is it a communist phenomenon. If Switzerland has low inflation, the United Kingdom in recent years has had inflation rates running up to 20–25% a year. Italy has inflation rates today of that order of magnitude. Inflation is not a capitalist phenomenon, it's not a communist phenomenon, it's a printing press phenomenon. Now, in saying that inflation is a printing press phenomenon, in saying that inflation is always caused by a more rapid increase in the quantity of money than an output, you're only at the beginning of the problem, because you must distinguish the immediate cause from the more ultimate cause. You must ask, why is it that the quantity of money increases too rapidly? But before I go on to that question, I just want to settle for once and for all the point that inflation is a monetary phenomenon. That proposition has been documented over and over again. We have evidence for the United States for over 100 years, for Great Britain for 200 years, for Sweden for 200 years. There has never in history been an inflation that was not accompanied by an extremely rapid increase in the quantity of money.